Hey, it's Farah Hanif with Rooted Black Girl, representing everyday Black millennial women. And today we're talking about vulnerability. Are you being vulnerable or are you just sensitive? We're going to find out today. Sit back and ride out with us.
Hey, Assalamu alaikum, Afnan. How are you?
I am good. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, I'm doing amazing. I just got finished reading the book Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. It's actually audio. Didn't I tell you it's an audio book? But didn't I tell you that I got the library app?
Yes, you did.
Your library card, you can go to the Libby app. And then, and shout out to Huda, friend of the pod, because she put me on and reminded me that I used to do this, but I totally forgot about it. And so if you go get your library card and then type in the back information on the barcode into this app, you have access to books upon books upon books that your local library has. And so I've been I got rid of my Audible because Audible costs $14.99 a month to listen to audiobooks. And I decided to get the Libby app, and I've been nonstop just listening, gassed up, right? And reading almost a book a week or listening to a book a week.
Nice.
It's a lot of fun. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I've really been enjoying it. So in this book, she talks about vulnerability, right? And so I know, and we've even discussed this when we kind of, so to speak, Nasima, a friend of the pod, she was talking in a clubhouse around storytelling, right? And I didn't know, but there were Spotify, big wigs in there. And then she asked me to pitch Rooted Black Girl. I said, girl, I came in here to support you. But she said, she was like, oh, so, they've kind of rebranded into initially to It's on the Move and then went into Rooted Black Girls. And she said, hey, can you explain the rebrand? And I was like, yo, me and Afnan had a conversation around vulnerability and really making people feel like they're not alone in their Black folk identity, right?
Right.
And so in this book, they discuss what a lack of vulnerability, where that comes from. And it's typically to escape judgment from people and really to prevent yourself from feeling the feels and kind of garnering or moving in the direction of fear, right? Or kind of moving past that.
Yeah.
But interestingly, and this is what I thought was fascinating, she said, it's at the helm, vulnerability is at the helm of any good or meaningful human experience. Yes. And often the thing that we want most, to be loved, to have joy, to feel like you're belonging in a space, rooted the key to it is vulnerability. So the very thing that we are fearful of is at the helm and rooted in the meaningful experience we want for life.
Yeah.
And so I was blown away, and I was like, "Man, we have to talk about this."
When you told me the title, I was super excited because I shared it with the pod. I think maybe this was last year in our first season. I was sharing that I went through this period where I was trying to psychoanalyze myself. So before I had gotten to therapy, and I read all the books. When Amazon suggests in the bottom, oh, if you're reading this about your dysfunction, you should read this too. I said, all to cart. So I have a crazy library of stuff, and I had read that several years ago when I was reevaluating all my relationships, and I was trying to figure out why do I feel so icky and I don't feel safe in any space. And I agree with you 100%. Because I had been running away from being vulnerable. I had been running away from being my authentic self, because the truth of the matter is yes, I'm confident and I'm outgoing or whatever, extroverted to a certain extent, but there's a big part of me that's very, very emotional, that's very, very sensitive, very sensitive. And I used to hate that when people used to say oh, you're so sensitive. It's oh, no, I'm not sensitive. I promise I'm not sensitive. Totally. But now I'm a sensitive bitch. I sure is. And there really is a beauty and there really is freedom when you embrace that. And that book was a game changer for me. So when you were I'm reading it, let's talk about it. I said, baby girl, let's talk about it. So you're 100% right. Once I kind of let some of that go, man, so many amazing relationships came in my life. And I realized once I gave myself that support and understanding, I could give it to others. I was I see you. Okay. Your authentic self ain't my cup of tea, but I acknowledge you and hold space for you, and we could just agree to disagree, whatever the case may be. But once I loved myself in that way,
Yeah.
I was able to expand my capacity to love others. And that helped me a lot.
Wow.
A
You know,
lot.
this was kind of one of my takeaway points that I wanted to add, but I want to add it now because you bring up a good point.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think we have difficulty around vulnerability because we don't trust ourselves, right? And we don't want to have that emotive kind of conversation with ourselves. So, one of the takeaway points that I was thinking about is maybe even journaling around like being vulnerable with yourself about what you're feeling, because sometimes we just, especially as Black women, we're like, we don't got time to feel the feels, you know. I got to keep going, I have to keep moving, and we don't want to have that conversation or really lean into our emotion because we feel like it doesn't serve us, right? But I think our emotion and being vulnerable with ourselves and what we want, what we don't have, how we're moving through these emotions is really rooted in understanding what and who we are, right? And sometimes we don't want to have those conversations because they can be quite painful to be a part of. But I just think that vulnerability is an active kind of engagement, right? And so we are, you know, like we're healing, we're moving, we're connecting, right? It's an ing, it's like an active conversation or
Ongoing action.
relationship.
Yeah.
It's ongoing action, right? um, so you bring up a great point, and that was one of my takeaways around like how do we start being vulnerable, and maybe it's being vulnerable with ourselves with like journaling through our emotion, right? And you know, and how we build vulnerability. In the book, she said something mind-blowing to me, as someone who doesn't really enjoy vulnerability, because of course, like I've been, you know, especially, and I don't want to hold people to who they were when they were younger, but they realize something about you and then use that as a way to bring you down, you know. And I've done that in undergrad, not so much in high school, but in undergrad. And so that made me decide to put an armor up so that people couldn't bring me down, right? And so but what she says beautifully in the book is the to build a trusting relationship, you need vulnerability. But how you build a trusting relationship is by giving vulnerability. So it's the sequence that's almost in tandem, right? And then she was like, well, then how do you, if you need trust to build vulnerability and know that it's a safe space to share, then how do you do that? And so she recommended, she's like, my child actually came up with this analogy and I took it and ran with it. But she said that you should have like a jar, a marble jar of trust, right? That you're thinking through. And when someone calls you and asks you how your day was, or holds space for you, or remembers your grandmother's name or your birthday, right? This all adds to the overall jar of trust. And then at that point, you can share, right? And that you shouldn't just share with everyone, right? It's for people who you have kind of created a trusting relationship around, with this marble jar understanding that you're building trust as much as you're building vulnerability, right? So I thought that was amazing. And just to kind of lean into my own personal space, I remember I was at Huda's second wedding, and you were there too, right? But some of the girls, we went to like this chicken halal spot. It was bomb, right? Just creating a scene here so you guys can kind of see. It was like this bomb chicken wing spot in Worcester or Providence, Rhode Island or Boston. So we're there, and one of our friends, friend of the pot of Sean, she kind of said it in jest, but it was such a big moment for me. She was like, Farah, like I've known you for so long, but you don't really give us a lot. And I was like, oh, you know, and she said it really small. She probably doesn't even remember, but I just recognized, I was like, oh my God, I've been friends with this group of women for like 8 to 9 years.
Been a long, mashallah, yeah.
A long time. And I don't share, you know? And partly because I don't really share with myself. I'm just moving, right? It was grad school, it was life. And I always share that part of my life. But it made me think like, oh, what relationship am I creating with people, you know, where they don't know much about my life or what I'm going through or how I'm dealing or coping with it. And so at that time, I think it was around April 2019, I kind of started having the conversation around like vulnerability and creating kind of deeper, more deeply rooted relationships with people.
I really appreciate you sharing that. And I totally agree that I think for me as well, kind of like what I was sharing before, there was a moment where I realized like I'm half-ass showing up in these relationships, but also really long for these close friend groups, right? These close relationships, intimate relationships. But I can't do that in a space where I am not fully present And I remember reading that in the book, and I remember like, okay, when people check in on me, that's an opportunity for us to establish more trust. And I remember practicing that and being more attuned to when people were doing that, and also when people weren't. Hey girl, how you doing? Okay, anyway, and just moving on. And I was like, okay, that's an indicator for me that maybe I need to be careful with this person,
Mm-hmm.
because they're not on the same wavelength of me right now. And it's not judgment, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
just, I know how sensitive I can be, and I need to be around people who are a little bit more present, like they see me a little bit more authentically. And so I would try to be like, hey, I'm just checking on you. And then if they didn't reciprocate necessarily, I wouldn't like write them off, but I would make a mental note of, okay, this may not be a great space for you to try being even more trusting, right? And you shouldn't set expectations on them. Just control what you share so you feel comfortable. And it was super empowering for me, because I felt like a lot of times trying to build relationships prior to reading the book, that I would just give a lot sometimes. And then other times, because I had been burned, I wouldn't give anything. And it was kind of this like seesaw effect, versus like that marble analogy really helped me to look at like the little pieces of how trusts are built, like the conversations, the exchanges, and that's how really robust, like deep connections happen. It's all the little exchanges. And that was transformative for me. And so I love that you brought that up. I totally forgot that analogy in the book. But I remember vividly when I was reading that, we were actually going to a retreat with my line sisters. We had just crossed. And I remember feeling like super overwhelmed with all these amazing people we were meeting, but also feeling like I wasn't really being like myself, right? And I'm separating this from like Delta, because I don't want anybody to like to think that wrong. But like, I don't know if you've ever, even like if you've been to college, right? And you all of a sudden have all these personalities, and you're trying to figure out like, where do you sit? And being vulnerable, and like maybe that you feel differently, or maybe, you're a little bit more outgoing, or whatever the case may be. So I really appreciate that we're having this conversation. And I think honestly, that was the beginning of me finding really deep, loving, mutually beneficial relationships, where I could be honest about, listen, I don't want fake ass friendships. Like I have associates, I have a lot of people that I know, but the people who know me intimately, like I want the friendships where I can boohoo on the phone crying, and I can let it go and it feels safe. And you can do that with me. And I don't have to know your business for us to have that intimacy and that safe space. But like, if I'm going through the shits, I want to be able to say like, hey, I can't talk this week. I don't have the capacity. And the person on the other side is going to phone be like, what the fuck you got going on? Like, that judgment, and being like, oh sis, like I totally understand. Like, take care of yourself. I'm here if you need me. You know what I mean? And I've had people who, oh my God, mashallah, who sent me journals when I said something like that. And those again are trust transactions. You know what I mean? It's like when my friends are like, I just don't have it. I don't have it to give you. I'm like, oh no, I totally understand. But because we've been listening to each other, because we've been very, very connected, we've been able to have some, oh my God, some really, really amazing, alhamdulillah, mashallah, like relationships with some of my friends. So I really appreciate that. Those touching emotional things. So anyway, that's been really transformative for me.
Yeah, you touch on so many amazing points that I want to touch on.
Friend
of the pod, Dr. Christina Duyan, right? She was on the pod. And so she's, a close line sister of mine. And I remember talking to her, and I was just telling her where I was in my life, right? And how school had like warped my life, right? And I was looking for more and deeper connections. And she told me specifically, she was like, you have what I know about you, and I've known you for a very long time, is that you're low risk. And so with that, you're going to get lower reward, right? When you think about the building of relationships. And then she then told me like people who live higher risk kind of vulnerability. She didn't say vulnerability, but she said higher risk lifestyles around giving into relationships and taking, they often have higher rewards, right? And when she said that, it blew my mind. We didn't talk deeper around that. And so I've been kind of like walking and stumbling through that process, right? Of like giving. And so as kind of the firstborn of like an African immigrant household, we've already been told to be like givers, right? And to really disregard how we feel, right? Yeah. And so I've been thinking about like initially when I started this like higher reward seeking and higher risky lifestyle in a way of like really trying to gain connection with people. I, really didn't do it that well, right? And I wasn't, like she said, I wasn't looking to see if I've built trust with people, right? And then I would kind of love bomb them or bomb them with amount of emotion or feeling, but they hadn't earned the right to know that about me, right? Or to connect with me in that way. And so I think I'm in this cycle of like realizing and recognizing kind of this trusting relationship and really being attuned to like, are they giving me so I can give them, and not for a tit for tat, but really kind of what relationships are built on. Like, are we both sharing and are we both pouring into kind of this vessel of our friendship? And
Yeah.
so, in addition, there are people in my life that I love dearly, but Huda always talks about this, like the rings of friendship, right? And there are people who are closer to you, and so they're in this tighter ring. But then, and it expands, right, around what people can give you in that moment because they're going through their own life and not taking offense to it, but realizing that they're in the outer ring, and so maybe your reach for vulnerability and creating a trusting relationship isn't quite there.
Yeah.
And so taking people for how they show up, number one, and really kind of being attuned with uh, how you share with them and what you're sharing with them, right? And so you can take that into like, of course, first look, friendships are a lot easier to do this with, right? Because I
Right.
think friendships are, we allow each other a lot more grace than in partnered relationships.
For
And
sure.
so I definitely explored being more vulnerable with friendships because I knew that that was a space that's a lot easier to perform in and like really kind of practice
Yeah.
vulnerability. But often, like I think about what I did previously is that I often armored up. As soon as you showed me that you lacked the ability for me to trust you, I would put up like to avoid feelings, to avoid shame or anxiety or uncertainty with you, I would put up like a hard exterior. Armor is also a way for us to feel safe, to be coddled really in our feelings and
Of
to be
course.
in control, right? And I think if you look at it, like African immigrant daughter wants to be in control, has been given so much responsibility, has been told that the way that they receive love is by giving, over giving. And so I think we often armor up by not, trying to connect with people, but maybe over giving so that people feel inclined to give us what we want,
Yes.
not really
Say
seeing
that
what
part.
we need,
Say that
right?
part. Yes.
Yeah.
I definitely think that that's been a tactic that we've been taught, and I've learned not to use that, right? Because it's kind of manipulative when you think about it. Like, oh,
So
like in order to get what I need from you, I'm gonna give you. And I think that's human tendency when you talk about like the love languages, like the 5 love languages. If I like to receive gifts, right, I'm naturally more inclined to give gifts in relationships that I love instead of inherently asking them how they prefer to receive their love. And so I think that's normal without judgment, but something that I noticed. So I read that book, and then over the years after that, I realized that what I was doing, and what I was doing is, if I found that I couldn't trust you for whatever reason, or I didn't feel safe being vulnerable,
yeah.
I would do hard cutoffs. I'd be like, and it wouldn't be like an overt conversation, but what I would do is I'd be like, hey, you said this, for example, and it hurt my feelings. I would cut them off really like abruptly. And it wasn't like very overt in the sense of like I deleted their number or I would block them. But I realized the way I would cut people off was cut off my vulnerability. And I can do that and still be in a room with you and be like, hey girl, how's it going? Yeah, I'm doing good. Cool. And what it meant was the boundary shifted of where my vulnerability lied with you.
Mhm.
And I was a little immature about how I would do it. I was just learning and I didn't know any better. But now what I've realized is, as you're trying to figure out what spaces and relationships you're able to be vulnerable with,
Mhm.
the boundaries thing is the next conversation you need to have with yourself,
Yeah.
right? And there's a book, and I don't remember exactly what it's called. It's like How to Set Boundaries or something like that. It's like I'll drop it in the title, in the details like of this episode. So if you're on Instagram, it'll be in the comments, whatever the case may be. But I think that's the next step, right? Because when you realize that maybe you've given too much space to someone or too much vulnerability, how do you pull that back authentically without feeling like you're then like, oh, you want to do this, I'm gonna show you, and then yanking that back.
Yeah.
And I feel like what worked for me is realizing like, oh, I can be vulnerable with you. This was a game changer for me. I can be vulnerable with you in terms of like how we work together. I can be really empathetic to, I don't have energy, for doing X business project, or at work when we're working on, when like a boss assigns us to something, we have to do that. But that means that because of the way you and I interact, I'm never going to tell you about my family life. I'm never going to tell you about like my personal relationships. I'm never going to tell you. So I can be fully present in the confines of these safe boundaries for me. Yeah. And we have like a really great relationship at work, vulnerability at work, but I also feel very safe and understand where those boundaries. So like after 5, don't hit my phone because we're not talking about anything that's not work related, right? And that helped me a lot because even with family, right, I realized I could be really vulnerable to listen and to hear you about like, what's going on with you and your family and stuff like that. And like, kids and marriage and weddings and all that stuff. Like I could be fully present and fully engaged in those conversations. But like when it comes to me, no, I'm not talking to you about my career. No, I'm not talking to you about my money moves. No, I'm not talking to you about my marriage. No, I'm not talking to you. So it's authentic. Like this is just, you know what I mean? This is the parameters of our friendship, and you can be there. And then if people would challenge them, be like, hey, I don't ever hear about you and Fred. I'd be like, oh, that's a boundary that's important to me, and I'd like to keep it that way. And the minute they were like, well, we supposed to be friends, and people didn't respect it, I'd be like, okay, cool. Well, for my friendship, this is what's comfortable for me. I totally respect if you need something different in that relationship. I wish you well. And I would just release them with love.
Afnan, you are so great with boundaries. I've recognized that from day one, and I think you do a great job of like being vulnerable to the capacity in which you've lent to this relationship, right? And to the different relationships that you have. And so vulnerability, like with vulnerability, you have to think about your boundaries, and how you kind of transverse that space. Because I think mostly like I know I navigate relationships with family very differently than other relationships, right? Because that's a high risk and high reward environment, right? Yeah. But you have to be very, very careful about what you share, right? Because sometimes, it can be where family, both immediate and extended, are the people who have the ability to hurt you the most because they know the most about you, right? Yep. That's just in general. Any relationship where someone knows you the most, they can weaponize what they know about you.
Absolutely.
But you can't move in that way, right? Like, and really, and now if we're thinking about a spiritual aspect to this, really trusting the all trusting, right? And not being fearful of people. Because I remember in Clubhouse, someone's like, "Oh, it's a safe space," and I was like, "Man, Clubhouse ain't no safe space, bro." Like, but I lean into the space of Allah, right? And knowing I'm sharing this for the right reasons, right? Yes. And with the right intentions, if we will, but that no matter what you decide to do with this information, I did it with the right intention and through the connectivity of with you, right, through my Lord, right. So I just I'm also reflecting on, is there space for men to be vulnerable? And I'll just share some information that she left in the book. She was signing books at a book signing, and a man came up and was like, "Hey, so what's your research on men and vulnerability?" And she was like uncomfortable. She's like, "Okay, yeah, like I really kind of study mostly women, right? They're the ones who come to the research panels, or like when she's researching stuff." And he was like, "Go figure." He was like, "Let me tell you." He was like, "My wife and kids, they're over there. They would much prefer that I die on the hill of strength and not showing weakness and lack of vulnerability than to show any level of weakness. They would prefer me to die on that hill of like being a strong man." And in the research, she also found when she started studying men more, their biggest fear was people calling them a pussy. Like, that's not a word that I enjoy, but that's what she said in the book specifically. Like, that was the information that through and through, no matter what type of class level anyone had, was to show weakness and to be the P word, right?
Yeah.
So I then was reflecting on, is there space for men to be vulnerable? And even the men in my life, I friends, acquaintances, siblings, we've been talking around this, and I have been like, giving people their flowers on the ability that they can show up as men, with vulnerability. But what are your thoughts around that before I share?
You know what? I think it's tricky. And here's why I say this. I have seen men use the new age of vulnerability as a crutch.
Ooh, okay.
Right? And I think they're in healthy relationships, in healthy marriages, work relationships, there's got to be space for vulnerability. And I do think that as a society, we don't talk enough about the vulnerability of men. However, I have seen some men who have misused the space that women attempt to hold for vulnerability as as an excuse, or as like I'm missing the verbiage now, but like as permission to not to do less, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I do understand there is a tremendous amount of pressure on men that maybe as a woman I would never understand,
Yeah.
to perform, to earn, to do this, to do that. Even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like God commands men to do different things than women, right? And so I respect that and I honor that, and I don't play with that. But
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, this new age sense of we can split things 50-50 sometimes is contorted to be that you can do less so that Black women, and I'm speaking as from Black women because I am a Black woman, not because we're exclusive in this experience, right? So that Black women can lift more of the load. And that's I don't flip and subscribe to that, right?
Yeah.
It's not that like, oh, a Black woman or a woman in a relationship can earn more independently so that you can kick your feet up and relax. That's not it. It's saying that in terms of the 100% workload, we can change what is the 50-50. It doesn't have to be I always do the dishes and do the clothes or whatever, or women have to do that and you have to earn exclusively. It could be that we can mix the two. But I have seen some men, and it's really sad. I've seen some men take this vulnerability thing as like, oh no, let's do a 70-30 split because you're capable of being more nurturing and emotional. And now women have demonstrated that they can also earn money at a higher capacity than men in a lot of situations.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the shit that like really fucking bothers me, because
Oh.
that it really it destroys what the author is talking about in terms of creating real authenticity about who we are. Does that make sense? And I'm not men bashing. I'm just saying I wish men would be a little bit more. Some men, I wish a little bit. Some men would use that as an opportunity to lean in, to be more transparent about what they want, so that we could work together as opposite sexes to bring the best out in each other. And I'm not talking about just partnerships. Like this to me goes beyond that. Even like workspaces or familial spaces, like with siblings or with cousins or with things like that. I think it doesn't have to be all or nothing. I would really like to just see some more balance. But I know I just went on a tangent, but what do you think about it?
That's a nuanced piece of
It is.
information there, right? I know that I feel like men mostly are like, hey, women want vulnerable men, right? We want men who kind of can lean into the divine feminine, so to speak, and kind of speak from feeling and lack of certainty, right? But I can see how they may feel like it's a loaded question or like a loaded lean, so to speak, when you're like, please share yourself with me, but not so much where I feel like you're not a strong, powerful man. And then often, let's say if they do lean into that and they don't perform to the capacity that a woman or like a family member, if they're a provider, should do, then they're often told to man up. Right. And how damaging is that? So, to the spirit, when you really like, how do you create and speak from a space of fear or vulnerability, and then are shamed for that very action, right? So people are telling you to like show up and lean in, and I'm here for you, talk to me. You're just bottling it all up. But as soon as they share, you're like, nigga, if you don't man the fuck up, right? So I don't know, but I think, confidence like is vulnerability, right? And knowing that I think women have to create a safe space and invite men to show up. But I think I hear you in what you're saying, Afnan, and I think you're being beautifully vulnerable here, and so there's no shame around that. But I think you hit a great point around like, how can we both be vulnerable and create safe spaces for each other, but still be pushing each other forward towards the goal, right? And are there some men who choose to say that they, aren't doing well, or
I'll give you an analogy of what I'm thinking, right? So there was a podcast where there was like two women and two men. They were having a discussion around like gender norms, right?
Uh-huh.
And so the gentleman was like, man, be honest, like, and everybody's Black on the cast, right?
Uh-huh.
And they were like, be honest that women don't really want men unless they can perform. But at the same time, like women don't want to give respect. And the women were really taken aback. And I understood where they were coming from, because they were saying, here's the thing, men want to have power and influence and respect at the level of, if I say, if like, let's say, for example, the example that they were talking about was your woman's car breaks down, right? So say, for example, my car breaks down, and my spouse is saying, oh, we don't need to, like, I go to the mechanic. This is the example they were giving. I go to the mechanic says, oh, you need to spend $5,000 to fix this. Your husband says, or your spouse says, we don't need to do that. You don't have to do that. And as a woman, I'm just like, and this is what the woman was saying. She's like, yeah, but what if I really think that the mechanic thing, he's like, no, if I'm your husband, because they go together, like the couples, like they're couples. I probably should have said that. He's like, yeah, but like as your spouse, as your boyfriend, as your man, if I say, no, we don't have to do that, I want you to trust me, right? And she was like, yeah, I get that. But if you're wrong and my car is now out of commission, as a man, are you going to show up and provide, right? And then he was like, yeah, but what? And then he went to the vulnerability thing. He was like, but what if I don't have the means to? And she was like, then you don't get to demand the rights to guide me if you don't have the means to support me. And that's what I was talking about when the vulnerability piece comes in. Like, you can't come in and say, I want to have all of these rights and I want to have this respect and I want to have all this support, but then you still want to house that ego of like, I'm this and this and this.
Do you think, wait, Afnan. In that example, do you think his wife would have been responsive if he said, hey, babe, I can't afford that right now, right? But we're going to take care of this in the future, right? But I want to provide that for you. No way.
No, I don't think
she wouldn't have been down. She would have been like, I'll pay for it myself. I'm not going to be riding around in a hoopty, right?
No, but the thing is, he wanted her. In the example that he told his girlfriend, he's like, I wanted you to trust me. And she's like, yeah, but trust only goes, like, you can't tell me, especially as a boyfriend. They were talking about like hypothetically, but like, and even through spouses, like, you can't say, I want you to trust me, but you don't have any means to back that up, is what I was saying. And I think a lot that, like, that's relatable to a lot of women, because men want to have, and I know I'm getting down the rabbit hole.
No, you're fine.
I think men want to have all of the respect, but then want to split the responsibility. And that's not how it works.
Afnan, I think that's a different subject, right? Okay. Like, I'm down with you. You're right. It
just reminds me of the vulnerability.
No space do you think there's space in that dynamic? I don't hear space for him to say, hey, babe, I don't got it right now. And her not pop off. And I think he's doing himself a disservice by not being vulnerable around. He wants a level of respect, and he feels that if he shares his weakness or his inability to pay for it at that moment, that he's going to lose respect from her.
And that's what I'm saying. I would have loved for him to have been honest in the beginning to say, I would really, and this is the important part. This is go back to the vulnerability. Like, I think that vulnerability looks like is when you say, hey, I don't have the means, but I would like for us to do this. It's really important for me that we do this. I think that's much different, right? Yeah. But I think that the vulnerability piece in that goes to like what the author was saying about being comfortable to lean in and to be honest and to do it, with those small baby steps. And that's what I think I'm saying I want men to see, because there's definitely space for us to be building together, or for men and women to be building together in the workplace and in family spaces, and especially like with the spouse too, right?
Yeah.
And I think that men are taking some of the vulnerability thing and to your point, changing its meaning to be convenient. And that's what I don't like. I want to have honest.
It seems like that example is beautiful around like two people playing a role rather than playing within their lives. Seem to be playing on like, I have to be the strong man, although I can't, afford it in this moment, right? But I have to be strong financially. And her saying, I want to like lean in and not push him, and be kind of that demure woman who follows the lead, but you can't lead me, bruh. So it's just like they're playing these two roles of what relationships should be without having a conversation on what their relationship is.
Yes. And that I see that at work too, right? Like, and I think that example also reminds me of what I see men do in the workplace, right? Where they're not willing to admit and be vulnerable that they may not know something or they might not have this expertise. But men are trained to pretend, like act like you know it even when you don't, but you still want everybody on your team, especially females, to just like comply. You know what I mean? Or you expect females to be able to, be transparent about where their limitations are, but the same is not for men. And that's my thing with vulnerability. I think vulnerability it needs to have space for both men and women to be able to do that authentically in the beginning. Vulnerability is not like a token that you can wave at the end of it to get you out of a tough situation when you bit off more than you can chew, or your ego. That's the biggest thing. It's the ego thing. And I think, yeah, for both sides, but that's what I was talking about specifically with your question about men. So hopefully that's clear.
No, and you hit it right on the nail. I think it's about both men and women holding space for each other and building trusting relationships, right? And then being vulnerable around kind of how they're building this trusting relationship, and not having judgmental feedback or like criticism, and really honoring a person when they have the courage to share.
Yeah.
Right? And I could tell that I think I'm speaking from it on a theory base, especially in the relationship sector, right? Because I'm sure it's hard in the moment, right? Because you're just like, man, if you don't man up, and they can be like, well, you can't tell me what to do when you can't provide for me in that way. So it seems like the forest through the trees. It's easier for me to see it as someone who is like, I'm theorizing about it. So I don't have the answers here. I hope that inshallah, when I'm partnered, that I can hold space for people, right? And for men or for the person in my life. But it seems like a tough thing to do. Vulnerability is not for the faint at heart, but it's at the helm of beautiful, meaningful experiences and relationships. So, I think we're just scratching the surface here, Afnan, and I think we're going to have to revisit this subject within the year around like how we're participating and choosing to garner and create vulnerability in our relationships.
Yeah. And I just get so frustrated when I see episodes like that, or I see, and I have friends, and I'm not going to put their business out there, who have shared some of those things with me. And that's what makes it tough. And I've experienced it probably the most at work. I think that's what's so triggering, is like, I immediately think to like super sexist coworkers. And even though like that might not be like my experience, like in my marriage, I could only imagine what that feels like in like a spousal relationship. But when I saw that, it literally took me straight back to the office of like, man, like some of these men just don't get it. And they're, especially like, in a corporate space where you really got to walk and do the talk, and this whole macho bullshit is the thing that is really triggering. So thank you for holding space for me to kind of talk about, some of the things that we've experienced at work. And I think that you're right. I think it's a good place for both men and women to reflect about like, how do we become better partners, especially going back to the episode we had last week, which is about like community, right? If we're going to be engaged in these conversations, vulnerability is something that we got to hold space for with, our other male members of the community, for sure.
Exactly. It's really foundational for any community or relationship that we're building, right?
I hope my male coworkers don't watch this. They're gonna be like, "Oh shit, she's pissed."
I mean, I think like she says that vulnerability equals courage, essentially. Yeah. And so then her other book, and I'm reading that too. It's called Dare to Lead, and it's about leadership in workplace. Okay. And a lot of the CEOs that she interviews then talks about creating courageous work culture, which is around vulnerability, right? And when you have CEOs who are mostly white men, right, that vulnerability isn't what people lead into, you know? And then you think about Black men on top of that, where you have racialized oppression. So I just think it's a lot tougher in the Black male space to be vulnerable. There's no space for it, when you're like fighting for your life every day. So I get why people end up in kind of acting in a way in their life of like how they're supposed to be, when really we need the mirror to ourselves to be like, what am I doing right now? Right? And why am I doing it? Again, it's tough.
Yeah. I'm going to have to read the other book, because clearly I got some more things to work out with vulnerability.
You got it, girl. You got it.
Yeah. But we appreciate this conversation. Thank you so much, Farah. And I love these transparent talks where we can be vulnerable. Again, no pun intended, right? With some of the things that we're working on, I know that a lot of people shy away from these conversations, and it could get difficult to admit and to share publicly, like, the things we're struggling through, like in our personal lives or at work or whatever the case may be. And so I appreciate Farah for always holding space for us to talk. And I encourage anybody who's watching and listening that we hold space for you as well. So can you continue the conversation in the comments? Let us know, if you guys are like me and you guys have had some triggering experiences in corporate America or nonprofit or whatever industry you work in, let me know. I would love to like connect with you. And then if you also resonate more with like Farah in terms of like thinking about vulnerability and like your friendships and things like that, let me know down below in the comments. And if you guys are on podcast or any other platform, please make sure you rate and review. We'll check you guys out next time.